In the year when the sun seemed to hide its face and the cold bit deeper than memory could recall, an empire that had stood for centuries found its heart slowing, its breath catching in the frozen air, and before the snows melted it would be gone. This is Candle and Coffin. Let's uncover the forgotten truth beneath the ashes of history. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this story travels. They called it the Winter of Ashen Skies, a season when the wind carried not just snow but whispers of prophecy. When the rivers turned to glass and the roads became white veins across a dead land. When even the fires in the great halls burned. Lo, as if afraid of the dark, the empire was already wounded before the cold came. Its treasury bled dry by years of war on three fronts. Its legion stretched thin from the high passes of the eastern mountains to the salt-crusted coasts, where the enemy fleets prowled like wolves, its core rotting from intrigue and whispered plots. But it was the winter that made those fractures fatal. In the capital, the grand avenues that had once echoed with the clang of markets and the laughter of festivals now lay silent under a thick shroud of snow. The statues of long-dead kings and conquerors wearing crowns of frost, their stone eyes, staring blankly over an empire they could no longer protect. In the countryside, villages vanished beneath drifts higher than a man's head, grain stores froze solid, cattle perished in their pens, and the roads that should have carried relief were swallowed by blizzards so fierce they buried whole caravans. In the palace, the emperor, a man not yet old, but aged beyond his years by the weight of a crown too heavy for any mortal, sat in his chamber, its brazier sputtering against the creeping chill, reading the reports that came in with each passing day, each one a nail in the coffin of his realm. Rebellions flaring in the provinces, water outposts abandoned to the snow, and in the far north, an enemy kingdom whose riders knew the ice as well as others know the palm of their hand, already moving across the frozen rivers like shadows on glass. Yet still, in those first days of the winter, there was a strange, stubborn hope, the belief that spring would come, that the ice would break, that the empire's heart still beat beneath the frost. But hope is a delicate flame, and when the cold is deep enough, even fire forgets how to burn. The first cracks in the empire's frozen armor did not come with the crash of armies, or the roar of siege engines, but with the soundless surrender of men's hearts. In the outlying provinces, governors who had sworn eternal loyalty to the throne began to send no messengers, no tribute, no troops, their silence louder than any declaration of war. For they had learned that in winter, distance becomes a weapon. The capital was too far, the roads too buried, the soldiers too few to enforce the emperor's will. And so, from behind the white veil of snow, petty kings began to emerge like weeds through ice, raising their own banners over towns once sworn to the imperial eagle, promising food where the crown could only send prayers in the mountain passes. Supply trains vanished into snowstorms that roared like living things, their bones found months later, wagons overturned and frozen horses still harnessed. Men huddled together in their final embrace beneath a drift as hard as stone. The legion sent to secure the frontier found themselves fighting not the enemy they had trained for, but the land itself, their spears splintering in the cold, their armor biting into flesh with frostbite, their commanders forced to choose which hundred to feed and which to let starve. And in the capital, the emperor's council fractured like ice underfoot. The war faction demanded a desperate strike into the north to cut the enemy's advance before the thaw, while the peace faction whispered of envoys and gold, of buying safety while the empire still had coin to spend. Yet even as they argued in heated chambers, outside the palace gates the poor burned wagon wheels and torn furniture to keep their children alive, their smoke curling up into a sky as gray as morning cloth. In the taverns, once loud with song, men spoke in hushed tones of omens, of wolves descending from the forests in numbers unseen for generations, of crows gathering on the palace walls, of dreams where the statues of the old kings wept ice instead of tears. And somewhere beyond the frozen rivers, the enemy's riders moved like a tide beneath the snow-laden pines, their scouts vanishing into the blizzard without a sound, their eyes fixed on the heart of the Empire, patient as the cold itself, knowing that sometimes the deadliest siege needs no walls breached, only time and hunger as allies. It began with a frozen river, a silver serpent coiled between the Empire and its oldest enemy, a barrier that for centuries had dictated the seasons of war. In summer, it was a moat, wide and deep, its currents fierce enough to swallow a legion in minutes. But in winter, it became a road, a cruel, glittering bridge that no wall or watchtower could guard. That year, the frost was so deep that the river froze solid weeks earlier than anyone had known in living memory, its surface smooth and pale under the warm light, strong enough to carry horses, siege carts, and the iron ambition of an invading host. The Northern King, a warlord of wolfish patience and glacier-cold cunning, had waited for this moment like a hunter waits for his prey to sleep. And on a moonless night, when the blizzard had muffled all sound and the Empire's frontier sentries huddled in their watch posts, he sent his first wave across, not an army in shining ranks, but small, swift companies of riders wrapped in furs, their armor hidden, their hooves wrapped in leather to make them silent as ghosts. They struck at the outposts first, cutting down the watchfires, slaughtering the sentries before they could cry alarm, dragging survivors into the dark to learn the state of the Empire's defenses. By dawn, the smoke of burning garrisons rose in thin columns over the white horizon, and when the news reached the capital, it came like the crack of ice beneath a traveler's feet, sudden, sharp, and impossible to ignore. The Emperor ordered the 3rd Legion north, a proud force of veterans and frost-hardened auxiliaries, their banners still bright against the snow as they marched out through the city gates. But the winter was a traitor in its own right. Sleet blinded them, snow swallowed their campfires, and on the 6th night, as they bivouacked on the banks of that same frozen river, the enemy struck again, not in a grand battle, but in a harrying assault that turned order into chaos. Riders came screaming out of the dark, hurling torches into supply carts, cutting down officers before their men could rally, and when the Legion tried to form ranks, the ice beneath them betrayed them, cracking under the weight of hundreds, plunging men and horses into black, freezing water. By morning, the river was still again, the snow covering the bodies as if nothing had happened, and the 3rd Legion existed only in memory, their loss leaving a wound in the Empire's defense that no army could patch before the thaw. It was then the people began to whisper not of if the Empire would fall, but of when. For they had seen how quickly winter could devour an army, and they knew the enemy was still out there, waiting, with the patience of ice. The news of the 3rd Legion's annihilation arrived in the capital like a shadow crossing the sun, and with it came the first open tremors in the palace's foundations. The courier who brought the tidings stumbled into the council chamber half frozen, his lips blue, his eyes wild from the horror of what he had seen, and though his voice shook, the words were clear enough to drain the warmth from every face present. The banners of the Legion lost, the river claimed by the dead, the enemy now unopposed on the northern road. For a long moment, no one spoke, and then the chamber erupted. The generals raged at each other, accusing rivals of failing to reinforce the frontier. The Treasury Minister declared that the coffers could no longer sustain another full campaign, and the Chancellor, gray and sharp-eyed as a crow, whispered to the Emperor that perhaps it was time to seek terms. But the Emperor, his hands gripping the arms of his throne until the knuckles whitened, would hear no talk of peace, for he knew, or believed, that to sue for peace now was to invite the enemy into the heart of the Empire, without a single sword raised in defiance. Yet while he spoke of honor and legacy, his subjects spoke of hunger and survival. And in the taverns and markets the whispers began to take a dangerous shape, that the Emperor had grown proud and blind, that his court was a nest of vipers feeding on the last scraps while the people froze. that perhaps the empire would be better served if another hand guided the crown. The nobles, sensing the wind shift, began quietly sending their sons and gold away from the capital, under the pretense of winter estates and family safety, but in truth laying the groundwork for defection should the invaders reach the gates. And as the city grew colder, its great avenues became corridors of despair. Mothers begging at bakery doors that had no bread to give, soldiers gambling away their armor for a bottle of harsh liquor, priests preaching of divine punishment for the empire's sins. In this frost-bitten atmosphere, every rumor became a spark, and it was not long before one of those sparks caught a letter intercepted on the northern road, bearing the seal of a high lord and addressed to the enemy king himself, offering mutual benefit in exchange for protection. It was never proven who had sent it, but the mere existence of the parchment was enough to convince the emperor that betrayal had already set root in his own court, and from that night onward, he trusted no one fully, not his ministers, not his generals, not even the guards at his chamber door. For winter had shown him a truth colder than ice, that an empire can crumble from within long before the enemy crosses the walls. It happened not on a battlefield, but in the silent hours before dawn, when the city slept beneath its white shroud and the palace fires burned low, deep within the fortress-like granaries that guarded the empire's winter stores. A single lantern bobbed among the stacks of grain sacks and barrels of salted meat, its light revealing the bent figure of a man whose name the empire would never know, but whose actions would be carved into its doom. He moved quickly, with the precision of one who had studied the layout for months, perhaps years, striking flint to oil-soaked rags hidden at the base of the central supports. The fire took at once, feeding hungrily on dry timber and the rich fat of stored goods, and within minutes the granary's great beams were groaning in the heat. By the time the first watchman raised the alarm, the night sky over the capital was painted with a sickly orange glow, the snow around the building hissing as it melted, and the air filled with the acrid stench of burning wheat, food enough to feed the city through the winter gone in a single act. The emperor, roused from his chambers, stood on the palace balcony as the smoke curled upward, his jaw clenched not in sorrow but in the cold recognition of what it meant. This was no accident, no drunken lamp overturned, but the work of a traitor who had chosen hunger as his weapon. The investigation that followed turned the city into a nest of paranoia. Guards searched every home within the walls. Neighbors whispered against each other, and more than one innocent man swung from the gallows in the public square to satisfy the mob's demand for justice. Yet the real saboteur was already far beyond the city gates, riding hard toward the north with news for the enemy that the capital's granaries were ash, that famine would gnaw the empire's heart faster than any siege, and as if the winter itself conspired in the treachery, the very next week brought the coldest storm in living memory, locking the city gates and walls of ice, and making the delivery of what little food remained nearly impossible. In the frozen villages beyond, the enemy's scouts moved with renewed boldness, knowing that each day they lingered meant more mouths unfed, more soldiers weakened, more will to resist drained from a people whose loyalty was already fraying. And in the palace, the emperor's council grew quieter. The arguments dulled not by resolution, but by despair. For they all understood, though none dared to speak it, that an empire without food is already an empire under siege, and the snow was their enemy's greatest general. The enemy's first great push came not with the thunder of catapults or the crash of siege towers, but with a slow, deliberate tightening of an invisible noose. From the north, their riders fanned out across the frozen plains, not striking the capital directly, but carving it off from the arteries that kept it alive. Merchant caravans were ambushed before they left the shelter of their towns. Fishing villages along the ice-locked rivers were put to the torch, and every road that led toward the city became a graveyard of abandoned carts, their contents looted or burned. They called it the Hunger War, and the enemy fought it with a surgeon's precision, cutting away the empire's lifelines until the capital stood alone, an island in a sea of white. The emperor, desperate to break the stranglehold, sent what remained of the 5th Legion to escort supply trains from the fertile southern provinces. But the march was a death sentence. Blizzards swallowed columns whole, ice claimed the unwary, and when the survivors staggered back into the city weeks later, they brought more tales of loss than grain. Meanwhile, the enemy established a chain of forward camps, little more than clusters of black tents and fire pits, scattered like dark seeds along the frozen frontier. Their banners, wolf heads on fields of deep red, could be glimpsed from the Empire's watchtowers, a constant reminder that the invaders were not retreating with the winter, but growing stronger in it. And then came the first sign that they meant to press closer. A village less than a day's ride from the capital's outer walls, found burned to the ground. Its people gone without trace, not dead, not escaped, simply vanished, as though the snow itself had swallowed them. Panic seeped through the city like a slow poison. For the people understood that their hunters were no longer content to bleed the empire from afar. In the council chamber, voices rose in desperation, the generals demanding one last, all-or-nothing assault to drive the enemy back before the thaw. The ministers warning that the army's strength was a shadow of what it had been, that to risk it now was to gamble the last hope of defense. But even as they argued, the enemy was already on the move, their columns slipping southward through moonlit snowfields, their scouts marking the river crossings and the wooded approaches to the capital, for they knew that hunger had done its work well. When they finally came, the city would not meet them with the roar of an army, but with the hollow eyes of a people too cold, too weak, and too empty to fight. The first touch of the enemy's hand upon the capital came in the form of a probing strike, a cruel test designed not to conquer, but to measure the weakness of the walls. It was just before dawn when the watchmen on the northern gate saw them, dark figures moving through the snow, no banners, no drums, only the muffled crunch of boots and the glint of steel. Beneath the pale light, at first they thought it a small raiding party, perhaps 30 or 40 men. But as the fog rolled in off the frozen river, shapes multiplied, melting in and out of the mist until it was clear that this was no mere raid, but a deliberate pressure against the city's skin. The alarm bells rang, hollow and cold in the winter air, and the defenders scrambled to their stations, gaunt men in mismatched armor, shivering as much from hunger as from the frost, their breath rising in clouds above the parapets. The enemy advanced in silence until the first volley of arrows fell, black shafts hissing into the snow, and then they broke into sudden motion, ladders slamming against the walls, grappling hooks biting into stone, axes hammering at the gate. The defenders fought with the desperation of cornered men, hurling rocks, boiling pitch, anything they could find. But their numbers were too few, their bodies too frail, and for a moment it seemed the enemy might breach the gate before sunrise. Then, as suddenly as they had struck, the attackers pulled back, melting into the white haze, leaving behind only their dead and dying as grim markers of how close they had come. It was not victory, not truly, for the emperor and his generals understood the meaning of such an assault. The enemy had taken the measure of their defenses, had seen the thin ranks upon the walls, the slow speed at which the towers could be manned, the sluggishness of soldiers whose bellies were empty. And perhaps more dangerous than the attack itself was the fear it left behind. For in the streets that morning, people whispered that if this had been only a test, the real blow would come soon, and when it did, the walls would not hold. In his chamber, the emperor looked out across the frost-glazed roofs of his city and felt, for the first time, the quiet certainty that the enemy was already inside, if not in flesh, then in spirit. For once a people believe their fall is inevitable. The gates are already opened in the wake of that probing strike. The emperor moved with a desperation that stripped the gold from his crown and left only the steel beneath. He summoned the envoys of every house, city-state, and border kingdom that had once sworn fealty or friendship to the empire, calling in oaths older than the frost, dead inked in blood and sealed with the bones of kings long turned to dust. Messengers rode south and west with the speed of hunted men, their satchels heavy with promises, titles, gold, trade rights, even the hand of imperial blood, anything that might buy a sword for the defense of the capital. In the throne room, beneath the great banners that now hung limp in the cold air, the emperor received what allies he could muster, a gaunt-faced duke from the western marches, who brought 1,000 men but demanded the right to keep any lands. His soldiers took in the fighting, a mercenary captain with a scar across his mouth who pledged his pikes, only so long as the coin flowed in advance, and from the far south, an aged queen carried in a litter, her voice as cracked as the parched, earth she ruled, offering grain in exchange for the empire's garrisons to guard her borders when spring came. Each bargain was another thread and a patchwork defense. But even as these agreements were struck, word returned from the north that the enemy's grip had only tightened. Villages, once loyal to the empire, now swore fealty to the invaders. In exchange for food, frontier lords declared themselves neutral, and the great southern caravans laden with grain refused to move, fearing ambush on the frozen roads. The emperor's ministers, hollow-eyed from sleepless nights, argued in low voices about which alliances could be trusted and which were but daggers in velvet. Yet there was no time for certainty, for the enemy was not idle. Their black banners had been seen at the mouth of the northern pass, their outriders skirting the woods less than 2 days from the capital, and rumors whispered of siege engines being hauled across the ice, grotesque shapes silhouetted against the orlit skies. Still, the emperor clung to the hope that enough allies would answer his call to mount one final stand. When the real storm broke, but in the quiet corners of the court, where servants and soldiers whispered beyond the hearing of lords, the truth was already being spoken plainly. No army could be raised fast enough, no promise honored quickly enough, to stop the winter that was already at their gates. The collapse of the emperor's fragile web of alliances came not with a single shattering blow, but with a slow, humiliating unraveling of each thread he had tied in desperation. The first to break was the gaunt-faced duke from the western marches. His 1,000 men never reached the capital, turning instead toward a disputed border fortress that he seized in the name of protecting imperial territory, a thin veil, for an act of outright theft. Then came word from the far south that the aged queen's grain ships had turned back to her own ports, the captains claiming ice-clogged rivers and unsafe roads, though whispers in the court said she had struck a secret bargain with the enemy to keep their war from crossing her lands. The mercenary captain with the scar returned to the capital's gates with half his pikes gone, their loyalty purchased by a richer purse offered in the night by an unseen hand. Even among the emperor's own lords, loyalties curdled. A count of the eastern provinces refused to send his cavalry, claiming he needed them to quell unrest at home, though it was said that unrest was nothing more than the people demanding food. He refused to part with. In the council chamber, the emperor listened as each excuse, each defection, was reported, his face a mask of ice while his hands trembled in his lap beneath the table. The court began to shrink, chairs at the long table left empty as lords fled, to raise troops and never returned, while those who remained spoke less of victory and more of survival, each man calculating what scraps he might carry away if the capital fell. And outside the palace walls, the people read the same truth in the faces of their leaders, that the empire stood alone now. Its allies vanished into the fog like deserters in the night. Meanwhile, the enemy banners were seen more frequently. On the horizon, their outriders taunting the city by riding just close enough to be glimpsed before wheeling away. Their wolves howling in the dark hours, the sound carrying over the frozen fields like the voice of winter itself. The emperor, pacing the high battlements one night, looked out over the snow and realized that his realm had already shrunk to the walls beneath his feet, that everything beyond them now belonged to hunger, frost, and the will of an enemy. who had never needed to break the gates to claim the empire's soul. The siege began without ceremony, without a declaration, without even the pretense of parley. One morning, the people of the capital woke to find the horizon ringed with black shapes. Watchfires burning in the snow, the silhouettes of siege towers rising like grim monuments against the pale sky, and the glint of steel where the enemy's lines shifted and coiled. The northern gates were the first to feel the news tighten, the roads leading out swallowed by earthworks and barricades, trenches carved into the frozen ground by men who had learned to fight as much against the cold as against any foe. To the east and west, enemy camps sprouted overnight, their smoke curling upward and thin. Disciplined columns, a sharp contrast to the chaotic, ragged plumes of the capital's dwindling hearths. By the third day, the city was encircled entirely. No messenger could slip out, no cart of grain slip in. The empire's beating heart sealed in an icy tomb. The emperor ordered every able-bodied man to the walls, from grizzled veterans to boys whose hands had never held a spear, their ranks stiff and pale against the gray stone. The enemy did not rush the walls immediately. Instead, they began the cruel work of wearing the defenders down, sending small companies to harry the gates, loosing volleys of arrows in the dead of night, and setting fire to the outer suburbs, until the sky glowed like a false dawn. At first, the defenders answered with defiance. Drums on the parapets, shouts hurled into the dark, sorties to cut down enemy scouts. But as the days turned to weeks, and the stores of bread shrank to crumbs, the rhythm of the city began to change. The markets lay silent, their stalls empty, but for the gaunt figures borrowing jewelry for a handful of millet. The priests no longer preached of deliverance, only of entrance. And in the council chamber, the air grew heavy with the unspoken truth that winter was not merely an enemy's ally. It was the enemy itself, relentless, patient, certain. From the highest tower, the emperor could see it all. The circle tightening, the black wolf banners snapping in the wind, the city beneath him growing quieter each night. And he understood that the siege would not end in a single decisive battle, but in the slow, methodical draining of life from within until the empire, proud and vast as it had once been, lay still in the snow. It happened on the 37th night, when the moon was nothing but a thin shard of bone in the starless dark, and the wind screamed low across the battlements like some ancient, restless spirit. The defenders were half frozen at their posts, cloaks stiff with frost, eyes half closed from hunger, when a strange stillness fell over the enemy camp. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace, but from the deliberate breath before a killing blow. Then, without warning, the blackness below the northern wall erupted in sudden firelight. As a volley of flaming arrows arced upward, their trails 1,000 fleeting suns, striking the parapets and towers with the hiss of burning pitch. Beneath that fiery canopy, the enemies surged forward, ladders on their shoulders, shields raised, the wolf banners at their back, moving with the cold, mechanical precision of men who had drilled for this moment through 100 winters. The first wave slammed into the wall like a living tide, grappling hooks biting into stone, ropes whipping upward as armored figures began to climb. The defenders fought back with everything they had, hurling stones, upending cauldrons of boiling water, slashing at hands and faces as they appeared over the lip. But the enemy kept coming, their dead replaced before they had even hit the ground. For one terrible heartbeat, the northern tower's torchlight vanished, replaced by the sound of steel on steel and the guttural cries of men locked in close combat. And the fear rippled down the wall like a physical force. Then came the breach. A section of the battlement where the stone had been weakened by frost gave way under the pounding of a battering ram, sending a chunk of the wall crumbling inward in a roar of snow and dust. Enemy warriors poured through the gap, their boots crunching on ice, their blades flashing in the torchlight. The city's fate teetered on the edge. But then, from the heart of the capital, a reserve force, cavalry dismounted, their horses too weak from hunger, charged into the fray, shields locked, spears leveled. The clash was brutal, men and weapons vanishing into the swirling snow. And for an hour, it was nothing but chaos. The air thick with smoke and breath and blood. At last, with a desperate push, the defenders drove the enemy back through the breach, collapsing it with whatever stone and timber they could drag into place. When dawn came, the wall still stood, but its defenders were fewer, their faces drawn and pale. And in the silence after the fighting, every man knew the truth. The enemy had tested the wall, and they would be backed up by the time the 45th day came. The siege had ceased to be a war and had become something slower, uglier, a quiet devouring from within. The city still stood, its walls unbroken, but inside those walls the empire had begun to rot, not from enemy steel, but from the slow knives of hunger and doubt. The grain stores were gone. The last oxen had been slaughtered and the soup boiling. In the great cauldrons of the poorer districts was nothing more than snow, boiled leather, and the bitter weeds that grew between cobblestones. Children coughed in the corners of cold rooms, their faces hollow and waxen, while men argued in hushed tones about which noble had stolen the last cartload of barley. The emperor's proclamations, read from the marble steps of the palace, rang hollow now, flowery words about honor and endurance falling on the ears of people who could taste nothing but ash. Whispers began to drift through the frozen streets like smoke, whispers that the emperor had kept secret stores for his own table, that the generals had squandered the city's food on feasts before the siege, that maybe, just maybe, the enemy outside was not the true villain. The guards, once proud, now stood sullen at their posts, their eyes following every passing citizen with suspicion, fingers drumming nervously on spear shafts. In the taverns, those dim, smoky rooms where the last barrels of sour wine were being sold by the cup, men began to speak openly of surrender, their voices low but steady, as if testing the taste of treason. The great families of the court no longer met together in the emperor's hall, each retreating to their own guarded mansions, their loyalty to the throne fraying under the weight of fear. And then, on one frozen morning, the people awoke to find the palace gates barred shut, the plaza before it empty but for a single cart. A cart piled with the bodies of soldiers, their armor stripped, their faces slack in death. No one knew who had left them there, or why. But in that moment, something subtle shifted in the heart of the city. The walls still stood, the banners still flew, but the faith that had held the empire together through the first weeks of winter was gone, replaced by a thin, hard mistrust that would not be. It began, as such things always do, with a single quiet meeting in a room where the fire burned low for comfort. Lord Varkin, once the empire's most loyal general, now sat across from a cloaked figure whose face was hidden in the flicker of the embers, their voices little more than murmurs. Beneath the groan of the wind, the two men spoke of possibilities, of arrangements, careful words that clothed the naked truth of betrayal. Varkin's soldiers, once feared across the steppes, were starving like the rest, their loyalty bending under the weight of empty stomachs and unpaid promises. The cloaked envoy slid a small pouch across the table, the sound of gold coins inside muffled yet deafening in the silence. And with it came a folded parchment, an offer of safety for his family, land in the conquered territories, and a title. Under the new rule, if only he would see to it that the southern gate was left unguarded for one night. Varkin's hand hovered over the pouch, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the fire as if searching for the face of the man he had once been. But the fire offered no counsel, only shadows. And slowly his fingers closed over the bag, the metal cold, against his skin. By morning, the pact was sealed, though no word of it passed through the city. No whisper hinted at the deal. Varkin returned to his duties with the same stern face, barking the same orders, and no one noticed the faint change in the way he studied the walls. Not as a shield to be defended, but as a thing to be opened. Beyond those walls, the enemy tents glowed like a second city in the snow, their watchfires patient and unwavering, as if they too knew the hour was coming when the empire would no longer be defended from without, but from within. The signs were there for those sharp enough to see them, though in the chaos of hunger and cold they passed like whispers in a storm. Guards who should have been stationed at the southern watchtower were quietly reassigned to patrol the market square, a market that had little left to guard. Varkin's veteran captains found their men ordered to repair the northern wall, a section untouched by siege engines, while the southern gate's hinges, long stiff from frost, were left without oil, wagons of firewood, and grain, instead of being distributed to the frontline barracks, were rerouted by command to empty warehouses, their locations kept vague. The cargo never seen again. A new curfew was announced, keeping the city's restless citizens indoors just after dusk, the very hour when the streets near the southern approach would be cleared of eyes. Still, the soldiers muttered among themselves, some about the madness of these orders, others about the strange, calm confidence in General Varkin's face, as if he alone could see a spring that no one else believed in. And beyond the walls, the enemy watchfires seemed to grow brighter each night, casting long, hungry shadows toward the gate. From a distance, the snow at their base looked trampled and darkened, though whether from the hooves of horses or the blood of spies was a question no one dared ask aloud. The city's heart beat slower, heavier, as if some deep part of it already sensed that the walls, which had stood for centuries, were no longer meant to keep the enemy out, but to keep the people in until the moment came to hand them over. It was a night that seemed carved out of black ice, the moon smothered by thick, low clouds, the air so cold that each breath felt like inhaling splinters. Snow muffled the city streets, the world hushed except for the groan of the old gates in the wind. Under cover of curfew, the southern quarter lay dark and deserted, save for the faint, deliberate steps of a handful of figures moving in silence, their cloaks heavy with frost. At the southern gate, the watch was thin, 2 men, both handpicked by Varkin and loyal not to the Empire, but to his whispered promises. Torches burned low, casting just enough light to glint off the frost gathering on the massive iron hinges. Varkin himself appeared from the shadows, his armor unbuckled, his sword sheathed, looking less like a commander than a weary guardian coming to check on his post. And yet, with a nod, the 2 guards moved to the great wooden beam barring the gate. Slowly, agonizingly, they lifted it, the groan of the wood swallowed by the wind on the other side. A darkness shifted, men and horses, waiting without sound, their breath pluming in the frozen air. The first crack of the gate revealed a slice of that other world, the glint of steel, the shape of siege ladders carried like coffins, the shadowed faces of riders leaning forward in their saddles. And then, with the smooth inevitability of a decision made long before, the gate opened wide enough for the enemy to slip inside like a tide, boots crunching on snow. No war cries, no trumpets, only the quiet efficiency of wolves entering a fold. Above, the city still slept, unaware that its winter had just turned into a funeral. They came in like a shadow poured across the snow. No clashing steel, no shouting, just the muffled rhythm of boots and the whisper of blades leaving their sheaths. The first to fall were the sentries on the lower wall walks. Their throats opened before they could even gasp. Their bodies lowered gently into drifts that swallowed them whole. Small squads peeled away into the alleys, each with a precise purpose. One toward the watchtower, to slit the bell ringer's throat before alarm could sound. Another to the granaries to seize the stores before looters or fire could claim them. Another straight for the armory, where sleepy quartermasters never saw the black shapes behind them until the dagger found their spine. The marketplace, wide and empty under a pale sheen of frost, became a silent staging ground. Here the enemy began stacking supplies, laying out maps, positioning bowmen in the shadowed balconies of merchant houses. Even the stables were taken. In an instant, the keepers gagged and bound, their horses led out to join the enemy mounts now tethered just inside the walls. From every quarter, the net drew tighter, and still, the city dreamed in ignorance above it all. Varkin stood on the southern wall, looking down at the invaders he had invited. his face unreadable in the torchlight, a man watching his own betrayal unfold with the composure of someone who believed he had purchased survival. Though the currency was his people's blood, somewhere in the darkness, the first dog began to bark. And like the strike of a match to dry tinder, the silence of the city was about to ignite. It began with a single scream, shrill, panicked, ripped from the throat of a woman who had stepped out into the street and seen the glint of a blade in the torchlight. Then came the shouts, the crash of shutters slamming, the sudden clamor of boots pounding cobblestones as the first wave of soldiers poured deeper into the heart of the city. Bells tried to ring, but their tones were cut short by arrows or silenced by blood. Fire leapt from an overturned brazier in the market and in moments was racing up the canvas awnings, like a red banner announcing death's arrival. Women clutched children and ran, only to find alleyways blocked by armored men whose faces were hidden by steel and frost. The city guard, disoriented and scattered, tried to form a line in the main square, but they were struck from three directions at once. Their captain skewered before his orders could leave his lips. Steel clashed and shrieked. Horses screamed as lances shattered against shields. And the clean white of the snow turned ugly with the churn of mud and blood. From the highest balcony of the citadel, the emperor's chamberlain looked down in disbelief, frozen by the sight of his city unraveling before his eyes. While Varkin, somewhere in the chaos, kept moving, always ahead of the enemy's push, as if guiding them toward their prize. Above it all, the wind carried the smell of smoke and the bitter, metallic scent of the first winter's massacre, a scent that would cling to these streets long after the snow had melted. The citadel had always been the city's spine, its walls of promise carved in stone that no enemy would ever pierce the empire's heart. But tonight those walls became nothing more than a final trap. The gates shuddered under the battering ram, each impact thundering through the halls where servants fled and guards braced for a stand. They knew they could not win. Archers on the parapets loosed until their quivers lay empty, then took to swords, meeting the first wave of intruders in narrow stairwells, where the fighting turned into a suffocating knot of bodies and steel. In the throne room, lit only by guttering braziers, the emperor sat not as a ruler, but as a man whose empire had already slipped from his grasp. Crown tilted, hands clenched on the arms of the throne, eyes fixed on the great doors as if staring down his own. Executioner. When the doors burst open, the enemy did not rush in, but advanced with deliberate slowness, their leader stepping forward with the confidence of a man who knew this moment had been bought and paid for. Varkin entered last, his cloak spattered with blood, his face calm. He approached the throne, spoke no words, and simply knelt, placing a sealed scroll at the emperor's feet. Whatever it contained drew a faint, bitter smile from the emperor's lips, the expression of someone who understood to late the shape of the betrayal. Outside, the citadel's highest banners were cut down and replaced with a black standard of the conquerors, snapping in the winter wind as the city below lay in ruin. The empire's 1,000-year reign ending not with a roar, but with a slow, cold collapse of stone into silence. By dawn, the snow had stopped falling, but the city lay under a new kind of frost, the stillness of defeat. Streets once thick with traitors and laughter were now patrolled by foreign soldiers, whose armor caught the pale morning light like shards of ice. The market stood abandoned, their stalls overturned and their goods rotting in the cold, while the people moved like ghosts, heads lowered, speaking only when necessary, their language now a quiet act of defiance. The conquerors worked quickly, replacing city officials with their own, issuing decrees in a tongue most could not understand, renaming streets and squares as if history itself could be rewritten in a season. Temples were stripped of their gold, the sacred statues carted away, and the great library, the pride of the empire, was sealed off, its knowledge now belonging to the victors. In the taverns, whispers grew about Varkin, some calling him a traitor, others a savior who had bargained for the people's survival, though none could say for certain which was true. Beyond the walls, The emperor's body was buried without ceremony in the frozen earth, his name forbidden from public speech. Yet, in the quiet courtyards and the hidden cellars, a different kind of seed was being planted, not of rebellion, but of memory, the stubborn human insistence that even under occupation, the story of what was lost and how it was taken would be carried forward, waiting for the right winter to rise again. Centuries later, when the stones of the citadel had long crumbled and the conqueror's banners had rotted into dust, travelers would still pause upon the ridge where the city once stood, feeling the strange hush in the wind, as though the land itself remembered. The empire's roads, now faint scars across the hills, led to nowhere, yet the stories still walked them, carried in the mouths of shepherds, merchants, and poets who spoke of the winter that had swallowed a kingdom whole. In these retellings, the empire was neither saint nor villain, but a warning that no fortress is impregnable, no throne eternal, and no loyalty beyond question. The snowstorm that had once hidden the enemy's approach became a symbol in the songs, a reminder that ruin often wears the cloak of nature, fate, or inevitability, but always begins in the cracks we choose not to see. And though the empire's name had faded from maps, its fall left behind a sharper truth. That power is most dangerous not when it is challenged, but when it believes itself unshakable. In the quiet of winter nights, by the fires of distant villages, people would lean in to hear the tale, not just to mourn what had been lost, but to feel the weight of history pressing its cold hand upon their shoulder, whispering the same warning that had come too late to those who ruled here. An empire can be built over centuries, but it can vanish in a single winter.